pressure holding steady.
Check. Magnetos engaged.
Ready for takeoff when the fog lifts.
Check the hydraulics again.
All right, men, mount up. We hit the target at noon.
January 1943. 30,000 feet above Western Germany. The air thins into something hostile. Metal contracts. Breath turns sharp inside an oxygen mask. Frost creeps across cockpit glass like slow-growing ice. A Luftwaffe fighter claws upward, engine straining, wings trembling in the cold. Inside, the pilot's fingers ache despite thick gloves. His legs feel heavy. Every movement costs effort. This altitude was never meant to be comfortable. Only reachable for moments, only endured long enough to attack. Then he sees them. A formation of American bombers moves steadily across the sky. They are not diving, not rushing. They hold altitude with unsettling calm. Their gun turrets track smoothly. No frantic adjustments. No visible signs of strain. The German pilot closes in, expecting hesitation. Instead, he finds discipline. Gunners who can aim. Crews who stay alert. Bombers that linger where cold should have broken men and machines alike. Later, after landing, pilots will talk quietly among themselves. About how long the Americans stayed up there. About how little they seemed to suffer. About a detail that makes no sense at all. The enemy, it appears, has brought warmth into a place defined by cold. And that difference will begin to reshape the war in the air. Long before American bombers crossed the Atlantic, the war in the air had already been shaped by assumptions about altitude, endurance, and the limits of the human body. In the years after the First World War, air forces across Europe treated extreme altitude as a temporary condition. Fighters climbed high to intercept. Bombers climbed just high enough to survive. Cold was accepted as an unavoidable enemy, something to be endured briefly rather than managed systematically. Aircraft were lightly built. Weight mattered more than comfort. Heating systems were rare, unreliable, or ignored entirely. Germany embraced this thinking. The Luftwaffe, created in the 1930s under rapid rearmament, focused on short, decisive wars. Its doctrine emphasized tactical bombing, close air support, and fast-moving campaigns that would end before industrial strain or prolonged attrition became decisive. Aircraft were designed for speed and agility, not for long hours at extreme altitude. German bombers like the Heinkel, He-111, and Dornier Do-17 flew lower than later Allied heavy bombers. Their crews wore thick clothing, electrically heated flight suits when available, and relied on shared body heat inside unpressurized cabins. Frostbite was common. Oxygen deprivation was accepted as part of the job. Long missions in sub-zero temperatures were physically punishing, and commanders assumed this would always be true for everyone. Across the Atlantic, American aviation thinkers were reaching different conclusions. During the interwar years, the United States Army Air Corps developed its doctrine in relative isolation from immediate threats. With oceans on both sides, American planners imagined wars that would require long-range aircraft capable of crossing vast distances. Endurance, not speed alone, became central. Crews would need to function for many hours, not minutes, at altitudes where weather and enemy defenses were less dense. At places like Maxwell Field in Alabama and the Air Corps Tactical School, theorists argued that future wars would be decided by strategic bombing. Industrial centers, rail hubs, oil facilities, targets far behind enemy lines would be attacked directly. To survive, bombers would have to fly high, fly far, and arrive in formation with crews capable of doing complex work under extreme conditions. That requirement forced a different approach to aircraft design. American engineers began treating the crew environment as a system, not an afterthought. Heating was no longer a luxury. It was essential for performance. Electrical generators were sized not only to power radios and gun turrets, but also to support heated flight suits, cabin air circulation, and defrosting systems. Insulation was added where weight allowed. Oxygen systems were designed for continuous use over long periods. This thinking reached maturity in the late 1930s with the development of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The B-17 was not pressurized, but it was electrically heated in key crew positions. Warm air was ducted into sections of the aircraft where men had to remain alert. The cockpit, the bombardier's nose, the radio compartment. Crew members wore heated suits connected to the aircraft's electrical system, allowing them to function at temperatures that would otherwise have crippled them. This was not about comfort. It was about effectiveness. A gunner with numb fingers cannot track a fighter. A bombardier shivering uncontrollably cannot calculate wind drift. A pilot fighting hypoxia and cold fatigue will make fatal errors. American designers understood that altitude magnified every human weakness, and they chose to counter it. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, these ideas were no longer theoretical. Production lines expanded at extraordinary speed. Factories turned out bombers designed not just to fly higher, but to keep their crews operational once they got there. At first, this difference went unnoticed by Germany. In 1942, American air units arriving in Britain were few in number. Their early missions were limited. The Luftwaffe still dominated European skies and viewed American bombers as another variation of familiar threats. High altitude was dangerous, yes, but cold had always been part of the fight. What German pilots did not yet realize was that the Americans were planning to live in that cold. And when the air war intensified, the consequences of that decision would become impossible to ignore. By the summer of 1942, the skies over Western Europe began to change in ways the Luftwaffe had not anticipated. American bomber groups arrived in Britain not as scattered reinforcements, but as the visible edge of an industrial tide. Airfields across East Anglia filled with long, concrete runways. Hangars multiplied. Fuel dumps, maintenance depots, and barracks expanded outward into the countryside. This was not a temporary deployment. It was preparation for sustained aerial war. The United States Army Air Force is committed to daylight strategic bombing, a doctrine that ran directly against British experience. The Royal Air Force, after suffering heavy losses early in the war, had turned to night bombing. Darkness reduced accuracy, but it preserved crews. The Americans believed something different, that tight bomber formations, heavy defensive armament, and disciplined crews could survive in daylight if they operated high enough and long enough. Altitude became central to that belief. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator were designed to cruise above 25,000 feet. At those heights, temperatures routinely fell below minus 40 degrees Celsius. The air was thin enough to induce hypoxia in seconds without oxygen. Any exposed skin could freeze in moments. German interceptors were capable of reaching these altitudes, but only briefly and at cost. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf Fw-190 were optimized for lower and medium altitudes. Their cockpits were unpressurized and minimally heated. Pilots wore electrically heated suits when systems worked, but power supply was limited. In practice, heating was inconsistent. Frost formed inside canopies. Controls stiffened. The climate itself drained strength before combat even began. American bomber crews experienced the same environment, but differently. Inside AB-17, the cold was still severe. There was no full cabin pressurization. Crews moved through narrow, unheated sections where frost-coated metal surfaces. In critical positions, warmth existed. Heated suits functioned reliably. Electrically powered gloves kept fingers responsive. Warm air circulated around instruments and crew stations that demanded precision. This difference altered behavior in the sky. American bombers stayed at altitude longer. They held formation without descending to relieve crew strain. They flew steady courses over heavily defended targets instead of diving away quickly. To German pilots used to seeing bombers break off under cold and fatigue, this was unexpected. The first major daylight raids confirmed it. In August 1942, American bombers attacked rail yards at Rouen. The mission was small, but it signaled intent. As raids grew larger in 1943, against Wilhelmshaven, Bremen, Regensburg, and Schweinfurt, the pattern became clear. The bombers arrived high, stayed high, and absorbed punishment while remaining operational. Luftwaffe pilots, climbing to intercept them, faced a different reality. The ascent itself consumed fuel and stamina. By the time contact was made, pilots were already fighting cold-induced stiffness and oxygen deprivation. Engines ran close to their limits. Time on station was short. Combat reports began to mention it indirectly. German pilots noted that American gunners were unusually alert at altitude. Defensive fire remained accurate longer than expected. Bombers did not scatter as quickly as predicted. Formations held together even after sustaining damage. Behind these observations lay a simple, unsettling truth. The Americans had engineered endurance into their aircraft. By late 1943, as bomber streams thickened and escort fighters began to appear deeper over Germany, Luftwaffe leadership faced an uncomfortable reassessment. The enemy was not just numerous. They were prepared for a kind of aerial warfare that assumed suffering and planned beyond it. What had once been considered an unavoidable limitation, the cold, the exhaustion, the physical breaking point of crews, had been reduced to a manageable factor. And in the thin air above Europe, that realization would soon collide with reality in combat. At 25,000 feet, the human body begins to fail quietly. Vision narrows first. Reaction time slows. Fine motor control fades as blood oxygen drops and cold seeps into muscles. For airmen, these were not abstract risks. They were daily, lived experiences, hands that no longer felt triggers, feet that burned and then went numb, thoughts that arrived a fraction too late. German fighter pilots faced these effects almost immediately after leveling off. Their missions were short, intense climbs followed by brief combat windows. Cold exposure was rapid. Heating systems, when installed, were secondary to engine and weapons demands. In winter, pilots reported fingers stiffening despite gloves, knees locking in place, and fatigue setting in before enemy contact. American bomber crews endured longer exposure, but under different conditions. Heated flight suits, powered by onboard electrical systems, circulated warmth through wiring sewn into clothing. Boots, gloves, and vests reduced heat loss where it mattered most. Oxygen flow was steady, designed for hours rather than minutes. This did not eliminate suffering. Crewmen still described ice forming on eyelashes, condensation freezing inside fuselages, and metal surfaces burning skin on contact. But it preserved function. Gunners could track targets. Bombardiers could focus on calculations. Pilots could maintain formation discipline. Endurance became a weapon. In combat reports, American crews repeatedly noted staying operational despite damage and cold. German pilots noticed something else. Their opponents did not seem as physically degraded by altitude as expected. The body, long considered a fixed limitation of air warfare, had been partially engineered around. Heating systems rarely appear in combat statistics. They do not shoot down aircraft or destroy targets. Yet they shape everything that follows. American bombers carried robust electrical generators driven by their engines. These powered not only radios and turrets, but also heating elements and airflow systems. Design compromises favored sustained crew effectiveness over marginal increases in speed or climb rate. German aircraft designers faced different constraints. Smaller airframes, tighter weight margins, and limited electrical output left little room for comprehensive heating. Priority went to weapons, armor, and engine performance. Crew comfort was considered secondary, something pilots would endure rather than overcome. This divergence mattered at altitude. Heated cabins reduced fatigue accumulation. Crews could remain alert deeper into missions. Maintenance errors caused by cold hands decreased. Weapons jams caused by stiff lubricants became less frequent in warmer crew stations. To German pilots intercepting these aircraft, the result was confusing. They expected bombers to weaken as altitude and time took their toll. Instead, they faced opponents who could fight back consistently, mission after mission. Technology, quietly and without spectacle, had shifted the balance. Altitude granted safety, but only if it could be maintained. American bombers used height to reduce exposure to flak and fighters. Remaining high meant fewer course changes, steadier bomb runs, and tighter formations. Heated crew environments made this possible. Missions did not have to descend early due to crew collapse or equipment failure caused by cold. For the Luftwaffe, this created a dilemma. Interceptors had to climb higher, faster, and more often. Each climb taxed pilots physically before combat began. Engagement windows narrowed. Errors multiplied. By mid-1943, German units were losing not only aircraft, but experienced pilots, men worn down by cumulative strain rather than single catastrophic battles. The air war was no longer decided solely by tactics or bravery. It was being shaped by which side could function longer in an environment designed to destroy both machine and man. And as this reality settled in, the psychological gap between the two forces began to widen. For Luftwaffe pilots, the realization came slowly and then all at once. At first, American bombers were simply difficult targets. Heavily armed, well organized, flying higher than expected. But as missions accumulated, pilots began to notice something harder to explain. The enemy seemed less affected by the conditions that defined high-altitude combat. Interception reports from 1943 contained subtle clues. Pilots described bombers holding altitude even after defensive maneuvers. Gunners continued firing accurately late into engagements. Crews did not appear disoriented or sluggish despite the extreme cold. Some German pilots spoke of opening fire and expecting bombers to break formation, only to find them pressing on steadily. Others noted that American aircraft remained operational after long exposure at altitude, while their own physical limits forced disengagement. It was not admiration. It was disbelief. The idea that enemy crews could remain warm enough to function effectively at such heights challenged everything German pilots have been taught. Cold was supposed to be universal, fatigue unavoidable, yet the Americans had found a way to soften both. In private conversations, pilots compared experiences. The word beheased, heated, began to appear. Not officially, not in doctrine, but in talk among men who had felt the cold themselves and recognized its absence in others. Behind this disparity stood different philosophies of war. American leadership assumed a long conflict. From the outset, planners expected heavy losses, extended campaigns, and the need to replace both machines and men continuously. Aircraft were designed to be flown by crews who could survive multiple missions, not just one. This thinking aligned with American industrial capacity. Electrical systems, insulation, redundant components. These were expensive in weight and complexity, but acceptable in factories that could produce thousands of aircraft with standardized parts. Germany, by contrast, faced material shortages and strategic pressure early. Designs prioritized immediate combat effectiveness. Electrical power was limited. Fuel quality declined as the war progressed. Every kilogram saved mattered. Heated cabins became a luxury Germany could not easily afford at scale. As Allied bombing intensified, German leadership attempted improvements, better heated suits, cockpit modifications, experimental pressurization, and high-altitude aircraft like the Ju-86P. But these efforts came late and in limited numbers. The Americans had made their choice years earlier. Warmth altered more than performance. It altered morale. For American crews, knowing they could function at altitude reduced fear. The environment remained dangerous, but it was survivable. That knowledge mattered when flying into flak-filled skies day after day. For German pilots, the opposite occurred. Each climb into the cold carried dread, not just of enemy fire, but of physical failure. Fatigue accumulated. Confidence eroded. The realization that the enemy had mitigated this suffering struck at something deeper than tactics. It suggested a war being fought on different terms, where one side had turned endurance itself into a strategic advantage. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the skies over Europe grew more crowded, more lethal, and more revealing. The moment of decisive change was approaching. By the autumn of 1943, the air war over Germany reached a breaking point. American bomber streams now stretched for miles, layered at altitude, escorted partway by fighters pushing ever deeper into enemy airspace. The raids were no longer probes or demonstrations. They were systematic strikes against the industrial heart of the Reich. On October 14, 1943, the Schweinfurt, Regensburg missions crystallized the struggle. Hundreds of B-17s climbed into formation before dawn, engines thundering in the cold English air. Crews settled into routines shaped by months of experience. Oxygen masks secured, heated suits warming muscles, instruments steady despite the frost beyond thin aluminum skins. At altitude, temperatures plunged far below freezing. Outside, the aircraft's surfaces glazed with ice. Inside, breath condensed and froze on metal bulkheads. Yet in the cockpit and gun positions, warmth held. Fingers remained responsive. Mind stayed clear. German fighters rose to meet them. Luftwaffe units launched wave after wave of interceptors, pushing aircraft and pilots to their limits. The climb was brutal. Engines strained in thin air. Cockpits grew painfully cold. Oxygen masks hissed steadily as pilots fought hypoxia even before seeing the enemy. Contact came high over southern Germany. American formations held together under attack. Gunners tracked fighters approaching head-on and from the rear, firing with controlled bursts rather than panic spray. Bombardiers maintained their calculations as flak bursts rocked aircraft violently. German pilots reported something unsettling. The bombers did not descend under pressure. They did not scatter prematurely. Even damaged aircraft stayed at altitude longer than expected, pressing toward targets despite mounting losses. The difference showed in time. Where German fighters could remain effective for only short engagement windows, American bombers stayed on course for hours. Heated environments reduced the physical drain that normally forced crews to disengage or lose precision. Losses were heavy on both sides. Schweinfurt alone cost the USAF dozens of bombers. Yet the strategic lesson cut deeper for Germany. Even under intense opposition, the bombers had reached their targets and returned in significant numbers. The Luftwaffe had thrown skill, courage, and firepower into the sky. What it encountered was not just aircraft, but a system designed to function in conditions meant to destroy it. As 1943 ended, German commanders faced an unpalatable truth. The battle was no longer just about shooting down bombers. It was about whether their pilots could physically endure the fight long enough to stop them. And endurance, quietly, was slipping out of reach. The decisive shift came not with a single battle, but with a realization that could no longer be ignored. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting two enemies at once. One was visible: American bombers filling the sky in disciplined formations. The other was invisible: fatigue, cold, and physical depletion accumulating faster than replacements could arrive. American air strategy had matured. Long-range escort fighters, especially the P-51 Mustang, now accompanied bombers deep into German airspace. This forced interceptors to fight longer, higher, and under constant pressure. There were fewer safe moments to disengage, descend, and recover. At altitude, the disparity in endurance became stark. American crews, though exhausted, remained functional. Heated suits and warmed crew stations did not make missions easy, but they made them possible. Gunners continued tracking targets hours into flights. Pilots maintained tight formations even after evasive maneuvers. Bombardiers completed bomb runs under conditions that would have shattered concentration without thermal support. German pilots experienced the opposite. Prolonged time at altitude compounded cold stress. Muscles stiffened. Reaction times slowed. Decision-making suffered. Reports from early 1944 describe pilots aborting engagements not due to enemy fire, but because hands could no longer operate controls effectively. This erosion was cumulative. Veteran pilots, once the backbone of the Luftwaffe, were being lost, not only to combat but to physical attrition. Training programs rushed replacements into service, men with fewer hours and less tolerance for extreme conditions. The cycle fed itself. Losses increased. Experience declined. Attempts to adapt came too late. Experimental high-altitude interceptors with pressurized cabins existed on paper and in limited numbers, but they could not be fielded at scale. Resources were scarce. Factories were under attack. Time was gone. For American commanders, the outcome was becoming clear. Daylight bombing, once considered prohibitively costly, was now sustainable. The enemy could still inflict damage, but not at a rate that threatened the campaign's continuation. In the thin air over Germany, the Luftwaffe was being forced downward, not by a single technological breakthrough, but by the cumulative advantage of systems designed to keep men functioning where others could not. When spring arrived, bomber formations flew with growing confidence. Losses continued, but momentum had shifted. The sky, once contested fiercely, was beginning to belong to those who could endure it the longest. And as the balance tipped, the consequences would ripple far beyond the cockpit. The effects of the air campaign were measured first in reports, then in ruins. By mid-1944, German intelligence assessments reflected a sobering reality. Despite heavy losses inflicted on American bombers, the raids continued with undiminished frequency. Factories were struck repeatedly. Transportation networks fractured. Oil production, once protected by distance and altitude, became increasingly vulnerable. Within these reports, a pattern emerged. Luftwaffe debriefings noted that American bomber crews appeared capable of sustaining long missions with consistent effectiveness. Engagements that once caused bomber formations to weaken now produced fewer visible signs of degradation. Gunners remained accurate. Formation discipline held even under intense flak. German pilots, by contrast, showed signs of strain that went beyond combat losses. Medical evaluations recorded increased cases of frostbite, circulatory issues, and altitude-related fatigue. Pilots returned from missions physically exhausted, sometimes unable to fly again for days. The disparity forced acknowledgement. Senior Luftwaffe officers began to recognize that technological endurance, not just firepower, had become a decisive factor. The Americans were not immune to cold, but they had reduced its impact to a manageable variable. Germany had not. Attempts were made to compensate. Heated clothing was improved where possible. Cockpit modifications were ordered. Experimental designs emphasized high-altitude performance and pressurization. Yet these efforts remained fragmented, constrained by resource shortages and the constant pressure of Allied bombing. Meanwhile, American production accelerated. Bombers rolled off assembly lines with standardized systems refined through combat experience. Heated components were improved. Electrical reliability increased. Crews trained with confidence that their aircraft could sustain them through hours in hostile skies. The human cost remained high. American airmen still faced brutal conditions. Aircraft were lost. Men froze, bled, and died at altitude. But survivability had increased just enough to sustain the campaign. In German cities, the consequences were visible. Industrial output declined under repeated attacks. Repair efforts struggled to keep pace. Civilian morale suffered as sirens became routine and shelters filled nightly. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German power, now fought a defensive battle it could not fully win. Behind every raid lay countless small advantages accumulated over time. Heating systems did not appear in victory announcements or propaganda, yet they contributed quietly, steadily, to the ability to keep pressure on an enemy already stretched thin. As the war in the air ground on, the meaning of this imbalance became clearer, not just in statistics, but in lived experience. By the final year of the war, the imbalance in the air had become irreversible. German pilot memoirs and post-war interviews returned repeatedly to the same theme: exhaustion. Not simply from fear or loss, but from the relentless physical toll of fighting at altitude under conditions that punish the body as much as the enemy. Many described missions that ended not with combat decisions, but with physical failure. Fingers that could no longer close around triggers. Vision clouded by hypoxia and cold. Limbs that refused to respond quickly enough. These were not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a system pushed beyond its human limits. American crews, reflecting after the war, spoke differently. They remembered the cold vividly, the constant ache, the frost, the danger of exposed skin. But they also remembered that their aircraft gave them a fighting chance. Heated suits, warmed stations, and reliable oxygen allowed them to function when nature itself seemed hostile. This difference shaped post-war aviation design. Pressurized cabins became standard in both military and civilian aircraft. Environmental control systems were treated as essential, not optional. Designers accepted that protecting human performance was inseparable from combat effectiveness. The lesson extended beyond technology. The air war over Europe demonstrated that endurance could be engineered. That comfort, properly understood, was not softness but strength. Warmth did not make crews less brave. It allowed them to survive long enough for bravery to matter. For Germany, the realization came too late. Resource shortages, strategic miscalculations, and the cumulative damage of bombing prevented meaningful adaptation. The Luftwaffe's decline was accelerated by factors both visible and invisible, losses in the air and limits in the cockpit. When the war ended, the skies fell silent. Aircraft returned to bases that would soon be abandoned or repurposed. Pilots, on both sides, carried memories shaped as much by cold and fatigue as by fire and flak. What remained was an understanding written into the future of aviation, that warfare at extreme altitude is fought not only with weapons and machines, but with the fragile resilience of the human body. And in that struggle, the side that protected its people best had gained an advantage no enemy fire could easily erase. In the silent aftermath of the air war, one truth became clear. The cold was a weapon, invisible yet relentless. Above Europe, where temperatures fell far below what human bodies could endure, survival itself had become a strategic choice. The Americans had discovered that warmth, carefully engineered, could serve as armor, allowing men to function at heights where others faltered. It was a quiet form of power. No bomb exploded, no gun fired, yet it shaped battles and determined outcomes. The B-17 and B-24 were not merely machines. They were vessels of human endurance, extending the limits of what men could endure and giving strategy a tangible edge. German pilots confronted this reality with disbelief, struggling not just against enemy aircraft, but against a persistent force of human resilience enabled by technology. The lesson extended far beyond World War II. Aircraft design, high-altitude operations, and even modern aerospace medicine would carry forward the principle that performance is inseparable from human factors. Comfort in this context was not indulgence, it was survival. Systems that protected bodies became as important as weapons that destroy targets. In the end, the air war above Europe illustrates a quiet truth about warfare itself. Victory depends not only on firepower, skill, or courage, but on the foresight to care for the men who must endure the conditions that combat imposes. Warmth at 25,000 feet, a detail invisible from the ground, proved to be a weapon as decisive as any cannon, and it reshaped the skies, the soldiers, and the course of history itself.